Dr. Thomas, if you would conduct our roll call for us.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Davis,
Here, I'm trying to get my video started. I don't know. It's not doing it.
okay. Mr. Stevens? Mr. Stevens?
He's muted.
Miss Davis?
Here.
Dr. Yeager?
Here.
Yeager?
Here.
Dr. Dykeman?
Here.
Mr. Worthy?
Here.
Dr. Gant?
Here.
Dr. Knox?
Here.
Dr. Maddox?
Here.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas.
You're welcome.
Open up the floor to amend and or adopt the agenda.
I move that we adopt the agenda. Second.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Any questions or discussion? Okay. All in favor? If you would, Dr. Thomas, if you would do a roll call for us, and the motion is to accept the agenda as printed or as listed here.
Okay, yes, ma'am. Here we go. Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mr. Stevens?
Yes.
Miss Davis?
Yes.
Dr. Yeager?
Yes.
Dr. Dykeman?
Yes.
Mr. Worthy?
Yes.
Dr. Gant?
Yes.
Dr. Knox?
Yes.
And Dr. Maddox?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So our agenda will be as printed. We'll move forward with item number 1, which is, item number 3, which is our budget planning session. Dr. Thomas?
Yes. At this time, Mr. Griner is prepared to present the tentative budget items for the upcoming year. Mr. Griner, is Ms. Frazier with you as well?
No, ma'am. She's
Okay.
not.
Okay, so Mr. Griner has a presentation that will be on your screen, and then we can have any questions or thoughts after he is finished.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. The main purpose of this, we sent a timeline out, I guess, probably a month or so ago with the April 30th date, really just to kind of have a general fund budget discussion. The plan is to move forward like in previous years to do the tentative budget proposal in a couple of weeks. But I thought this would give us, kind of where we're at. In my 10 years of putting budgets together for school systems, this has probably been the most challenging on the revenue side, and we'll get into the aspects of that. I feel real good about the expenditure side. Ms. Frazier, as Dr. Thomas mentioned, Jennifer Frazier, who's been with the school district for many years and is a great asset on the budget side, has put a lot of hard work into this. So I want to give her some kudos for all her hard work. But the expenditure side is a little bit less cloudy as the revenue side. So we'll kind of walk through. Lisa put on the screen the revenue assumptions. This is what this is based off of as of today. I will say this is a changing document. We got additional information today on the CARES Act that we'll talk about shortly. QBE is based on a projection that was done back on December, which had our updated FTE from the October count, which drives the funding for the next fiscal year. If we didn't have any talk of austerity, I would feel good with QBE, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, because the legislative session, typically by the middle to the end of February, we have our QBE number for next year. Of course, they didn't finish the budget before the pandemic set in, so they basically are halfway through the session. The House looked at the budget. They're going to have to start all over with the budget because it's not the same budget they were looking at, I'm sure, previous to all this. So Speaker of the House, Royston, Representative Royston sent out an email, a memo, I believe I saw today, that they're not going back into session until the middle of June is the plan. He's trying to lay out some dates. to get everything back on track. So we won't know QBE more than likely till maybe, hopefully by the end of June. We may be into July. We can't really wait that long because we're going to mess the county up with the tax digest and tax notices going out. So I feel like we need to move forward. And Dr. Thomas and I had this conversation. So we feel like we need to continue to move forward with the budget process as is. We'll get into some other conversations too about budget meetings and how we're going to possibly hold those. So, but anyhow, QBE is based on a December projection. The tax digest is based on a 7% increase in the revenue assumptions. I've had conversations with the tax assessor's office. I want to give them a lot of praise. They're managing to put together a digest, working remotely, working in the office. Mr. Dunnigan does a great job with his staff on putting together the assessed values every year. We had a conversation a week and a half ago that we feel like 7% is a good number. They haven't finalized. I believe May 14th is their goal to send out initial notices to the taxpayers in Clarke County. But we feel like 7%. Last year, we ended up a little over 9%. When Mr. Hamill presented the budget last year, we were in the 7.5 to 7.8 range. So it ended up a little bit higher. So that could increase. Hopefully it won't decrease. We feel good with 7% though. TABT is our title ad valorem tax. Many of y'all probably know that when the old birthday tax went away, when you purchase a vehicle, you used to get a bill every year for the assessed value of your vehicle that was due to be paid by your birthday month. Now when new car sales, that money's actually collected up front when you actually purchase the car. Again, this is one of those items, there's really no way to anticipate what's motor vehicle sales going to look like. I know a lot of dealerships are trying to put together incentive programs to try to get people to buy new cars right now. So that number may not change. I did decrease it a little bit. I talked to the tax commissioner, and again, Ms. Meadows said there's just no way to know what the impact would be there. So we did decrease that a little bit. Interest income, I projected about half of what we brought in this year, which was around 800,000. So there's about 400,000 for interest income in the budget. Rates are already starting to come down. As you know, the Federal Reserve changed the prime rate to right around 0%. So all these numbers, the main number is that QBE number. We just don't know if there will be any potential austerity this year. Lisa, if you could go to the next slide on the expenditure assumption. This budget that the summary you're seeing tonight, and you'll get the graphs and everything in 2 weeks where we analyze comparative years. This includes a step increase for all eligible employees. I say eligible because we do have some employees who get to the top of a pay grade and there's just not a step anymore. They've stepped out, for lack of a better term. The employer portion of TRS this year is 19.06. That's set by a separate board, retirement board at the state of Georgia. That was actually 21.14% last year. So there's some savings there. There's not a whole lot as much as you would think though, because our revenue also goes down because we do get funded for a large portion of TRS through QBE. So there's not as much savings there as you think there would be by that going down 2%, because we also lose on the revenue side. Then we did a line item review of all department budgets. Ms. Frazier and I sat down with every department, went through their budget line item by line item. We tweaked items. We felt like, we did a comparison to last year. Why is it going up? We need a justification for that. We really didn't have a whole lot on the operating side that are increasing. It's pretty much staying the same, but we did do a line item review. Then we brought it back to the cabinet last week and kind of went through the same exercise we're doing with y'all tonight to kind of go through, this is where we're at. Lisa, if you don't mind, if you could go to the next slide. So if you take those revenue assumptions, take the expenditure assumptions, assuming there's no change in QBE. If we stop today, the state came back and said, we're not doing austerity this year. This is where we feel like we would be. We've got projected revenues of 169.7 million, projected expenditures of 171.2 million. That leaves us with a net deficit of 1.5. I will say, since our meeting on Monday and when we put this together, we probably found about another 200,000-300,000. We feel like we can reduce expenditures by just with some move. So that deficit is probably closer to 1.2 right now. That would leave our reserve percentage, based on what we feel like we're going to add at the end of this year, taking into account that deficit would be about 18.19%. Keeping in mind the state forever has kept 15% as kind of the goal that you want to be at. And that reserve percentage is taking our reserve balance, dividing it by the total budgeted expenditures, and that's how that's calculated. Essentially, you know, how much of the total is sitting there. So that's where that 18.19. So the CARES Act, this is an additional revenue source we will receive. It's based, I'm sure a lot of y'all are familiar with the CARES Act. Different pieces of it have been, you know, affected more on the individual basis. School districts, the Department of Education is actually receiving money through the CARES Act. It is, there's a lot of flexibility with this money. We got more guidance today. There's even more flexibility with this money. You know, you can be used for, these are examples. There's really an unlimited distance learning, you know, enhancing the distance learning profile in case we go through this again in another wave that's been possibly mentioned. Nursing services, plant services for Mr. Fisher, the disinfecting, the cleaning of our buildings. You know, there's going to be, I think I said this Monday in our cabinet meeting, we got to look for the new, or Tuesday when we did this, the new normal. What is the new normal? It's not the same that we left back in March when we went on spring break. We realized there's going to be additional expenditures on the nursing side, plant services, our distance learning. The one thing they added today was that there is flexibility if the state does do an austerity reduction that we can use this money to offset that. That's huge, because if we get into the scenarios with what happens if we lose 5% of QBE, what happens if we lose 10% of QBE, keep in mind that that CARES Act money could supplement some of that potential loss that we might have from QBE. And I will say that today we got an updated number, which will be our final number. We're closer to 5.8 million. They sent out this initial allocation a few weeks ago. They found out there was some with the formula they had to tweak at the Department of Education. So we're actually receiving 5.8 million. In our RESA district, we're receiving the highest amount under the CARES Act. It's based on, it's not Title I money, but it's based on some of the same provisions of Title I, which is why, since we're a Title I district, we're receiving a large amount under the CARES Act. So, Lisa, if you could go to the next slide. So what I did is I looked at QBE two ways. We really won't know till June. So let's look at it with a potential 5% reduction off that December projection. And then we also looked at it with a 10% reduction. What does that do to our numbers? 5%, we're looking same expenditures. The revenue number would be the only number that changes. We're looking at a deficit of about 5.2 million. That would bring our reserve percent down to 16.06. But keep in mind, the CARES Act, 5.8 million could be used. I'm not saying we're going to be able to use all that because, as I mentioned, we're going to have some additional expenditures. We're working through trying to put a budget together of, you know, what do we feel like we're going to have as necessities under the CARES Act, and then what's left over would be used to offset austerity and bring that, you know, forward. So it wouldn't totally offset the deficit like it looks like it would here, but it would definitely help, and we keep our reserve percentage probably in the 17 to 18% range. So Lisa, if you could go to the next slide. I hope this is worst case scenario. Honestly, we don't know. It could be 15%. I hope not. I don't think we'll go that low. A 10% reduction in QBE would leave us with a net deficit of about 8.9 million. Still leaves our reserve percentage about 14%. The one thing that makes me feel better about this, I hope this doesn't happen, is that the CARES Act would offset some of that deficit, and I feel like we could stay in the 15 to 16% range. I played with some numbers this afternoon and felt pretty good with that. So I think in any one of these three scenarios, our reserve percentage can stay above 15%. I think what we've got to decide is, if we push forward with a budget, do we want to go and say this is the potential worst case scenario and try to adopt a budget that has a 10% reduction? We come back, we get QB numbers at the end of June. We may not necessarily have them before the final adoption. So we come back in July and just do a budget amendment. Kind of some of the things we bounced around. A lot of districts are waiting till May. My only fear with waiting till late May to start this process, not finalizing a budget, say to July or August, is we're going to mess up the tax digest. And I think there's ramifications there, and that the county can't move forward with the digest getting it certified until they have, you know, our approved millage rate, which we can't really approve until we have a approved budget. So I think my fear is our tax bills go out in Clarke County with a due date that's earlier than most counties are due in October. Most counties are November, December. I feel like if we don't move forward with the budget process and then maybe make some amendments in July, that we're going to the digest, and that's going to create cash flow potential issues if, you know, the tax bills aren't due in October, but they're due in November and December. So Dr. Thomas and I and our executive cabinet kind of made a decision to kind of press forward with this, have this meeting tonight. You know, gives y'all a couple weeks to kind of digest these different scenarios. Lisa, if you go to the next slide, please. And then the next slide had the budget timeline, which I'll get to, but these are items in the budget that we really wanted y'all to kind of think, you know, between now and the 14th. When we talked about that initial deficit of about 1.2 million, these are items that have been on the table for several years. The first two, the last one hasn't been, it's totally new, which I'm gonna get Dr. Myers to speak to that. There was a compensation study, and Ms. Duke can chime in. I'm probably gonna get her to chime in here in a minute. Was done several years ago to try to get our custodial staff. You know, I think it was done for the entire district. Custodial was the one main area that we felt like we were out of line with districts around us. So there is included in the budget an $800,000 give or take to get our custodial staff, which is the entire district custodial staff, up to where we feel like they need to be comparatively.
I
I
vote
know
yes.
I've done, I'm sorry.
I vote yes.
Thank you.
And the next item has been on the table, I believe, for several years too, which is to try to get our pre-K teacher and para salaries more in line with the district positions, teacher and para-pro positions as well. That's around 435,000. Keep in mind, if there was no change in QB at all, this is really, if you look at a deficit of about 1 million, 1.2 million, this is really the two items that are, I mean, I feel like it's worth discussing if we had to use reserve to do these first two things, because I think they've been on the table for a while. It doesn't scare me that we would use that money out of reserve. Because, and again, even in the worst two scenarios, I think with the CARES Act money that we can supplement it to keep our reserve percentage where we feel comfortable as a staff, and y'all would feel hopefully comfortable as a board. Lynn, did you, or Ms. Duke, did you want to speak to either one of those first two items?
Sure. The compensation study was done for the whole district, and we found that we were losing our custodial staff to UGA. UGA has managed to get their custodians in TRS, which we cannot do. The state will not let us, and they also pay them much more than we do. And so the whole compensation study is about 1.2 to get every employee up to a competitive market. And of the 1.2 million, 800,000 of it was for custodians. So this gets all of them up to a competitive rate, and hopefully will help us, the attrition that we're experiencing in custodian. The pre-K teachers and paras, y'all know this story as good as I do. We lose our pre-K teachers to K-5. We get a good pre-K teacher, get them trained in everything pre-K, and then we can't keep them. So this 434,000 is to get them paid at their correct experience and certification. And, you know, it's just to explain it a little bit further. Remember, this is now going to come out of the general fund, so it won't hit pre-K's budget because they can't afford it. There's no money there for them. So part of our pre-K salary would then come out of our local dollars.
Okay, thank you. Real quick, I'll do the telehealth nurse, and then I'm gonna let Dr. Myers speak to it because she can give y'all a lot more detail on it. The telehealth nurse came about because of what we're going through now with the pandemic. It's in the CARES Act documents we got today under nursing. It's actually telemedicine is mentioned specifically. We left it in the general fund budget. We didn't have it coming specifically out of the CARES Act money. It could go either way. You know, my thing with sometimes funding staff positions out of maybe a one-time pot of money is you got to figure out how to do it the next year as well. So if you put it in the general fund, you don't lose sight of the fact it's in. So, you know, that's kind of something, it could easily go under, be a part of the CARES Act budget that we come back with, that $65,000, or it could stay in the general fund. Right now it's in the general fund budget. And I'll let Dr. Myers kind of walk through what we had in mind with that position and what that position would add to the district.
Thanks, Mr. Griner. Yes, this is something that Nurse Rourke and I feel is really necessary at this point in our school district's history to have a dedicated telehealth nurse to serve students and staff. We have actually had telehealth equipment since January of 2017. If any of you have had a telehealth appointment with a doctor, you might know that there's equipment that plugs into a computer. There's thermometers and scopes. They can look in your ears and your eyes and your nose. And we've had that really fancy equipment that was donated to us through a grant from AmeriGroup. And we've tried to manage it using our existing nursing staff for the past 2 years and have just not been really successful in utilization. And that's because our regular school nurses in their clinics are busy all day and they don't have time to manage scheduling appointments and using the equipment to serve the needs of students and staff. But we feel like with a dedicated nurse who could travel around the district, there'd be equitable access to these services. And if a student or staff member is sick, the telehealth nurse could schedule a same-day appointment on site from that school nursing clinic. We can access providers at our own school-based health clinic with Athens Neighborhood Health Center at the Hillsman Health Center. We have agreements with Piedmont Regional and specialists from across the state. A telehealth nurse could travel with tests, with COVID tests, with flu tests, with strep tests, and administer them on site to students and staff in the school nursing clinics under the supervision of a doctor, of course, that's on the other end. That's why it's important to have the telemedicine. So we already have a lot of the pieces in place. We're really just lacking the staffing. The other exciting part is if we get this rolling, telehealth is reimbursed by Medicaid and private insurance. Not only does the doctor and the provider get paid the same amount that they get paid if you go into the doctor's office, which is why this is booming and everyone's interested in it now. The physicians on the other end are not losing money. They're getting paid the same amount, but insurance will also pay a small amount to the agency that is providing that connection. And in this case, that would be us. So we feel like we could be maybe not reimburse the whole cost of a position, but if we get a position funded and get up and going, in subsequent years, we could recoup some of that funding. And so, of course, I really probably don't need to explain too much of why triaging who can stay at school and who needs to go home and why you have a fever might become critically important next school year. But we just feel like moving forward, it'll be more valuable than ever. We already are paying $189 a month for telehealth services. And honestly, they're just being underutilized because of the lack of personnel. So we feel like we're a step ahead by having equipment. Other school districts don't, and we do. We have MOUs and waivers in place, and it's a billable service once launched. So we're very excited about the possibility. And like Mr. Griner said, whether it's general fund or CARES Act funds, we feel like this could really, truly provide more equitable access to healthcare across the district. And I'm happy to entertain any questions anyone has and can provide you additional information, of course, as well.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Myers.
Mr. Griner,
Yes, sir.
may I chime in? I was thinking that we were going to have to wait until you finish your presentation, but if that's the case, because I have several, but is it?
Either way, Mr. Ware, I got one more slide. If you want to wait or if you want to go ahead, either way is fine.
Slide the string here. Conversation study with the custodial lab. And I heard before, in fact, we talked about this in our finance committee meeting. And a few minutes ago that UGA was able to get their custodians and the TRS program, teacher retirement system.
Mr. Worthy, I'm having a hard time understanding you. So, Mr. Griner, can you hear Mr. Worthy?
I mean, I
Mr.
heard.
Worthy, I think he's asking about the custodians being under TRS. Did I hear enough of it? Maybe not.
Yeah, we may have lost Mr. Worthy. I don't see
I
him.
just wanted to be sure that you could hear him. I couldn't make.
Yeah, I think
I
he was
got what
asking something
Lynn-
about TRS.
Yeah.
and custodians.
Yeah, I got what Lynn got. I think he was asking about TRS with the custodial staff.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to be sure.
Oh, no, it was kind of breaking up. So I was having a hard time too, Dr. Gant.
Me too.
So was I. I was getting ready to ask him to get on his phone again.
Yeah.
So, Lynn, let me, or any of our custodian, and I know every district does this different. I haven't do, like our head custodians, are they on TRS or no?
No, our head custodians and custodians are included in this 800,000.
Okay.
Just to be clear, our head custodians are custodians that are at the building that have supervisory roles, but they also have expectations to clean and do more.
Lynn,
Yes, sir.
okay, the question that I was going to ask, and perhaps we need to have our attorney look into this. And the law may have changed, but I thought, and I don't know, just twice a week to keep the current law with teacher retirement system because I'm retired. But having said that, I thought the current law was that the only way a person, an employee of a school district, wherever,
We lost him again.
Yeah, I think we lost him again.
I think he was getting to what is the rule for.
yes, that only way a teacher retires, they have a supervisory. And I'm still wondering, how is it that UGA can have custodians and make them a part of the teacher retirement system, and then Clarke County School District and perhaps other school districts can't do the same thing? Something wrong with that.
Yeah, when
Can I answer that? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
when Dexter Fisher came on board, he told me that little piece of information and I flipped out because I think that's tremendously unfair, but somehow UGA got in their custodians. We can't. Dexter may know how, why.
What happened back in 1975, a legislator, because at one time, all custodians, food service workers, groundskeeper were not part of the TRS system nowhere in the state. So they went, a local legislator, I'm not sure from what county or what district, proposed putting the university system employees, all employees, under the teacher retirement system. So that happened back in 1975, and they had the option of opting in. A lot of the custodians, food service workers did do that. Some of them did not, but they had the option in. So that was a constitutional amendment done, Mr. Worthy, in the Constitution to bring in food service workers, custodians, anybody that worked for the university system of Georgia became eligible for TRS. That unfortunate that did not happen with school districts.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but seeming that's conflicting with the law there, because like I said, I was thinking, no, the current law, you cannot be a part of the teacher retirement system with the school system unless you were in a supervisory position. We need to check on that because not only something is wrong with that, it's unfair, you know, but
We checked on it, Mr. Worthy. We've checked on it, and they're grandfathered in somehow, and they're not budging, and you know why they're not budging. They can't afford to, and so they're not going to let the custodians in. They're not going to expand TRS. I would be very surprised if they did.
What would need to happen, and Mr. Davis, since you're part of the government relations, it would take legislation to make that happen. The legislature would have to approve that for all school systems. And keep in mind now, if that happens, then that's going to be a cost though to the district. We have to pay our part like we do for everybody else now. But I think the way to go about that, it has to be some type of legislation put forth in order for school districts to make sure everybody could be a part of TRS.
But there's
I understand what you're saying, because see, if that happens, they'll have to put in, I say they, custodians, food service workers, et cetera, groundkeepers, they have to put in 6% the same as teachers. As Chris Brown said a few minutes ago, let's put it in around 19% And of course, it was 21% last year and it's down. But I still feel like we need to do some additional checking on that, because something that I don't see how one system can do that. Universities and colleges can do that, and the school system can't do it.
There's
What other job descriptions, Lynn, fall in that same category?
school nutrition and transportation. But there's good news. We recognize this as a district and we want to help educate our folks and make sure that everyone is prepared to retire. And we are, you know, some of you have been aware of the 403B conversation, and there's data. I'm not a finance person. Chris can probably speak to it a little bit better than I can. If an employee, when they start working and they work here for however long they want to, if they put away the equivalent of what they're putting in TRS, they can actually do pretty well on them by themselves as well. So we're starting a huge education program and we're going to target those folks first to make sure they understand that they are not going to have enough to retire off of with just PSERS. It's just not going to be enough. Maybe Social Security will be around when they retire. Maybe it won't, but they're going to need to invest their own money to make up a difference to be able to live off of a retirement.
So we don't have any
Okay.
retirement. We don't have any retirement plan except for that 403. Is that what we're offering?
They have PSERS, but they only contribute, Chris, is it $10 a month? Or
Yeah, I think it went up to
low-
like 10. It used to be
low
like
number.
6 or 7. So,
Mhm. And you know,
Yeah,
that's
when I,
gonna, I'm sorry. That money's just not gonna be a pension of any size. We have people that have worked with us for about 30 years and they're retiring with about a $300 pension. And you know, it's just heartbreaking. That's why we have a lot of older people that are still working because they can't afford not to. So we're
It's
trying
called what? It's called what's it called?
PSERS. That's the public school education retirement system, probably. I'm guessing, but it's public school something.
yeah, that sounds
yeah,
right.
that's what it is, Lynn.
Mhm.
And it's far better than what it, well, not far better, but it's better than what
Yeah.
it used to be, because when I was in the system and when I retired, they were putting in $3 a month.
That's
Now,
right.
you know, 30 plus years, no way a person gonna live out of that.
It was $6 until, you know, the past few years. And they raised it again. I just can't remember if it's 10 or 12, 8, somewhere around there. It's still low, very low.
But it's worth the government relations committee to check into that.
So do we contribute to this PS retirement system, or is it just the employee?
Chris, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, Mr. Davis. I think what I think we maybe contribute, it's a small dollar amount. I'll get you that information. I'm almost thinking it's mostly employee contribute. I know it's, if it
I
is,
think
it's a
it is
small
too.
dollar amount. But I think it's really all employee.
I think Dr. Knox has his hand up.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah, thank you. Getting back to the budget, I'd just like to ask a few quick questions. With regard to the TRS percentage for the employers, is that completely 100% locked in? Is there no emergency thing that they could do? Because I know I'm sure they're looking at their coffers and wondering if they're locked in. I just thought I'd ask that.
Yeah, that's a good question, Dr. Knox. I knew they set that rate like almost a year. It was set like back last September, October. I haven't heard any inkling that they're talking about changing it. I mean, they have the ramification. I knew with the initial budget, it was built in at 19.06, but again, the initial budget's not going to be the budget anymore.
Right. Okay. So then the next question I have is, do we know what the TRS percentage was going to be for the next fiscal year? Not this one, but the one after it.
No, sir. They normally, like this September, October, they'll let us know what it's going to be for the next year. Normally, I think it's around September, October. Lynn, you may know, but I think it's normally at their September, October board meeting they set it.
Because it'll probably go up, right?
That's
Yeah, it's probably
exactly
low.
what I was fixing to say. Based
Mhm.
on the fact of everything that's happened, it's probably gonna go up.
Okay, and another question looking to not this coming year, but the one after. I know it's a crapshoot, but do the economists are they projecting that we'll be somewhat back to normal? That this is going to be a 1+ year huge hiccup, but not a multi-year thing?
Everything I've read, Dr. Knox, and I've tried to keep up with it. I read like the AJC, just a lot of the stuff they've been talking about the budget, and I think the economists that are advising the state are just like they just have no idea what the overall impact is going to be next year. You know, I keep hearing that if we get everything back up and running, that hopefully it'll be a quick turnaround. And you also hear it's worse than 2008. So what that's going to mean for the next year?
Right.
I think one thing we've got to consider for FY22 is the tax digest. You know, we've had consistent 5% growth. And I think the real estate market in Athens is totally different. I think Dr. Yeager made that point when we had a property committee meeting. I don't think the residential side scares me as much as from when I talk to the tax commissioner, the commercial side, because you got a lot of businesses hurting that normally don't appeal their assessment. I think they're going to start. She mentioned that she anticipates they're going to start appealing their assessment and try to get a lower valuation on their property. So I think we'd see more of a decline. Fortunately, Clarke County is very fortunate with the tax digest. We have a lot of commercial property. Most, I can tell you from my experience in Barrow, 80% of their digest is residential. So you can imagine 2008 was not fun over there. So there is more balance in our digest, and that may not be as big a concern. But yeah, and then you start talking about the new car sales. How's that going to look a year from now? Yeah. I think the one thing we were trying to do with the presentation tonight is, you know, worst case scenario, hopefully would be the 10% reduction in QBE. We feel like we still have adequate enough reserves without making a lot of really hard decisions. I think FY22, if we continue the same baseline, would be when we go back to the 2008, the 2012 period where there's a lot of hard decisions that have to be made. You know, you start talking about looking, I don't even want to mention the word furlough, but but I think that's where you get further down the line with this. Hopefully it's a 1-year thing. We rebound. We still leave our reserves in a good position. And I'll give kudos to the board, you know, currently and previous boards for building. A lot of districts would love to have 19% reserves right now to work with. A lot of districts that I mentioned probably aren't moving forward their budget to July or August, really can't make some of the decisions we're able to make because they're going to have to wait and see if there's enough reserves there, CARES Act money to offset any potential, you know, furloughs, freezing of staff, hiring of staff. So I think the position we're in is actually very good because of the reserves we have. Now, I won't sugarcoat it. I mean, it's not fun to think about a 10% reduction. You know, you get kind of excited in finance when we hadn't had austerity for several years and you're thinking the economy keeps rolling. That's great. And then all of a sudden you have that bump in the road that you have to kind of rethink the whole process again. So.
And I had just one small potatoes question. One of the things I had mentioned, I think, in one of the emails or forms that we filled out about budget was, and it's illustrated tonight with our problems hearing Mr. Worthy, is communication, being able to hear people at board meetings, both in person and now on Zoom. Is there some small potatoes money that we have so that when we're on Zoom, we can all hear each other, and when we're in meetings together, the public can hear us as well?
I think I don't know if Ms. Duke wants to, did you want to jump in on
My
that?
husband, I think part of the challenge we have is that it's not in a permanent location, and being able to set up and take things down impacts it. But he would like to put you guys on wireless mics. That then means that you're wired all the time. So, you know.
Right. But yeah, and then the other problem is making sure that the video feed is getting the sound from the soundboard,
Right.
because it just hasn't been, the public doesn't like what they're not able to hear.
Right. And I think that in this environment, our new normal, that's going to become more important to people to be able to hear remotely. It's not going to be the option of maybe they just don't want to come in now because of other issues.
That's right. So I hope we can find some money for that.
Yeah, I think
Yes,
we can.
We can work on that.
Chris.
Yes,
Chris.
sir. Yes, sir, Mr. Ward.
Last slide, maybe ask this make if we have time when you go through that slide, I have about a couple more questions. But anyway, I think that you may be right on it with 10%, hopefully. And the reason I say that, I don't know whether people read this 10 times 10s that they send it out almost weekly, not weekly, I think that daily. The top 10 is coming out of the Capitol. Now, what I read and also what I heard, that this budget is going to be $4 billion short. $4 billion. Now, so you may be right on it. Hopefully, that could change some. And if it does, that would be good news. But anyway, I'll let you finish this last slide, and then if we have time, I have a couple of other questions here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Worthy. Yeah, I think, the quicker the state can get back to work on the budget, I think the better. So it was kind of encouraging to see at least they have a tentative date, because I think, they've got a lot of number crunching they've got to do. I know there's money in the rainy day fund at the state. I just don't know how much they're going to be willing to dip into that. And also, keep in mind, the state's still trying to figure out what to do with the federal money they may receive. I think the original thing I saw was they weren't going to be able to use it to supplement any loss in sales tax or income tax. I think at some point there's got to be some loosening maybe of that'll help hopefully with some of the revenue downfall that the state may anticipate on their budget. So we'll see. The last slide is kind of our timeline. I will say this is probably the first 2 dates in my mind are hopefully set, and then we're going to kind of hit a moving target. But May 14th, my idea would be to present the tentative budget, similar to what y'all seen tonight, with a lot more detail. Here's where the budget was last year. Here's where it is this year, the comparative stuff y'all are used to. Do a little bit deeper dive into the budget. More so, this was more the, I hate to say the 10,000 foot view, just to kind of get the conversation started. Then we give y'all a couple weeks to kind of think through any additional questions you may have. And then we come back with the tentative budget on the 14th. Plan is to call a meeting on the 21st, if that date works, to adopt the tentative budget. Then we got to try to figure out how our community budget meetings. Mr. Pruitt and I talked earlier this week. What does that look like? I know Governor Kip just this afternoon released some new guidance. You can gather with more than 10 or more as long as you keep the 6 feet distance. So that may be something we have to try to figure out, how can we make that work with a community budget meeting. But then also there's a shelter in place for those 65 and older. So, there's a lot of moving, and medically fragile. So I think we're going to have to rely on Mr. Pruitt, and we're going to have to talk through legally how to have those meetings. If there is a way to even have those May 26th, 28th, and June 4th. Ideally, if we have those 3 meetings as required by law, then we can do a final adoption. June 11th is a board meeting date. That's why I picked that date. Honestly, as long as we can have it adopted by June 30th, we're in compliance with the state of Georgia right now. So the goal is to have it a budget adopted by June 30th. And that would, keep in line with the county timeline on getting the tax digest certified and getting notices out as usual for them. My biggest concern are those community budget meetings. So hopefully we can digest some of the guidance that came out from the governor's office today, get with Mr. Pruitt and try to figure out what those are going to look like. That's what I said, a moving target. We just don't know. There are certain requirements around those meetings. They have to be in certain time spaces. You have to have at least a week gap between them. You see May 26th, June 4th. So we got to, there are certain constraints at the Department of Revenue. And we've been looking for guidance from the Department of Revenue how to have these meetings, and they haven't issued any yet. A neighboring district actually called the person who's kind of over that area, and he said, I can't really tell you anything right now. I think they were waiting on the governor to give some additional guidance as well with some of the shelter in place orders, which I know he's letting it lapse tonight. The one that expired April 30th, but he did, issue some new guidelines today. So we will hopefully have an update on that soon. Again, I'll work with Mr. Pruitt, Dr. Thomas, and I will to try to figure out what that looks like.
Okay.
Mr. Worthy,
yes, and perhaps, as I stated, I have 2 additional questions, and you may have already done this in your tentative budget. You mentioned earlier about the step raises, and
yes,
after the first year on that schedule, teachers don't get a step raise. And I think that it would be good to know how much savings, how much we have to spend with this budget for all of the teachers that are receiving step raises. And like I said, you may have already included that in your tentative budget.
I can give you that number, Mr. Worthy. Now the step raises, I can't give you specifically teachers. I can give you everybody in the district, whether it be teachers.
Okay, that's what
or
I'm talking about. Yes.
or classified. It's about $1.7 million. That's the step raise increase for next year.
Okay. Now you mentioned also, I think it was on the first slide there, $800,000 in interest. Is that the money that Larry Hammer invested with BB&T before they merged with SunTrust?
Yes, sir. What we normally do is we take our cash flows once we get our tax digest money in, say, October, November, and we ladder those out throughout the year. We did U.S. Treasury bills this last year, zero interest or zero coupon Treasury. This year we're probably going to bring in close to 800,000. I budgeted about 400 for next year. Again, I tried to do an analysis. I tried to lower the interest rate down to about 0.5, 0.65%. We've been earning about 1.6%. Hopefully we can catch the tail end and still get some higher rates, but it's not going to be anywhere close to 1.6% for next year.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Griner,
Yes.
you mentioned that, or no, I think it was Ms. Duke about the compensation study on one of the slides.
Yes, ma'am.
When was that done?
2017.
2017.
We're
Okay.
trying to put the money in the budget every year and it just keeps getting cut.
Okay. And you mentioned that compensation study, I think this is what I heard, looked at everyone, but we found that the custodial staff made up about 800,000.
Yeah, the custodial staff was most out of line.
Okay. Where do our food nutrition staff fit here in these items, or are they here?
They're paid either at or above market.
Okay.
They're not.
They are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I will say, Dr. Gant, school nutrition, and when we do the tentative budget, I know we're trying to work with Ms. Farmer right now, and honestly, she's the work her team's done with feeding students is incredible. So she's a little behind on getting her budget put together, and that's understandable. What we'll do is eventually school nutrition actually has a separate budget, and that would be included in their budget. But there is no, as Ms. Duke mentioned, I think that hasn't been a part of the budget the last couple of years discussion, but they do have a completely separate budget from the general fund.
People often say that our school nutrition are paid really low and they don't make a lot of money, believe me, but they also work 6.5 hours a day sometimes at 104 days a year. And then that's spread out over 12 months so they can have insurance during the summer. So the check ends up, and so then they get that check and then people take that check and divide it by 40 and come up with an hourly rate. And that's not, how it is, but that's what they're paid.
With the
Prorated.
Yes, sir.
with the CARES Act, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around a lot of aspects of this, but that was it 5 million that was listed here, Mr. Griner?
It's actually about, on here it's 5.3 million, Dr. Gant, but it's the final number we got today, which we'll actually have access to. The plan is for us to be able to utilize, the money will be available and we can use it through 2022. It's actually got a long period of time with it. And it's actually should be, the State Board of Education is going to vote on it and it'll be available next week. Our plan was mostly to use it in next year's budget, but it'll be about $5.8 million is our final allocation.
Okay, and that's not money that the school district has to pay back.
No, it is totally, it's a one-time grant. It's a reimbursable grant. We spend the money, we submit for reimbursement. There is a lot of flexibility. You have to do a budget for it. They say the budget will not normally contain the details you have to put in a budget that has federal money attached to it. They say they're going to try to make this as simple as possible because they know there's a lot of districts out there that if there is a budget covering the state, they're going to need this money. A lot of districts struggle through the whole you know, the last couple months have been hard on a lot of districts. This money's supposed to supplement some of that as well, where they've had to spend a lot of their maybe reserves to try to do distance learning. You know, we fortunately were in better shape there. We had some stuff already in place. I know Mr. Gaskins has some ideas on how we can enhance our distance learning. So that's something, you know, we'll probably be including in that budget as well. So, but we were fortunate where other districts were. So I think they're trying to streamline this process so districts can, and it also applies to school nutrition. I left that out earlier and that's my mistake. Also can recoup some of the costs that school nutritionists had to incur where they may not be getting reimbursed by the USDA. So it's some of the feeding programs we've had the last few, you know, trying to keep our kids fed or students fed, you know, it'll supplement some of that. And we just need, you know, Ms. Farmer, I think, has alluded to the fact they're definitely, you know, they're going to, the lost revenue on that side is going to be, you know, something we're going to have to look at as well.
Thank you for adding that, Mr. Griner. I was going to say that we have lost between $200,000 and $300,000 over the last couple of months with our feeding program because we're not in school, and we do hope to use some of the CARES fund for that. In addition, as we look to how we're going to creatively return back to school, that may continue to be an issue. So having that, because that program is totally self-funded. It is not funded by the district, it's self-generating a fund. So wanting to help support Ms. Farmer and her team with that, if possible, using the CARES fund.
Yeah.
Also, Dr. Gant, we hope to be able to use some of those funds to purchase some type of digital learning platform. So when, I dare not even say if now, when we have to return to some form of distance learning, we will have a program that will help specifically with our K-8 students to have a standardized learning module at home that they can access through devices.
That's exciting.
Yeah, I think what we talked about in cabinet, and Dr. Thomas brought up a great point. I think when we first started talking about the CARES Act funding is strategically thinking through how we're going to use that. Now that we have the flexibility to use it for any state budget cuts, I don't think there's no way we're going to be able to take the full 5.8 and use against the state budget cuts, because I think, as Dr. Thomas mentioned, we're going to have some other needs in the district which aren't budgeted in this budget. And I think that's why we're trying to work up a separate budget for the CARES Act. And then knowing we're going to have to set aside some of that money for potential state cuts. And then in July, we'll have a much better picture because we'll have our state number, and then we can go, okay, this is how to best deploy the CARES Act. Maybe it gives us a couple months to kind of get our thoughts together on how to spend that money strategically.
I've got a couple of questions. One thing, Lynn, you said that from the compensation study that we found that we were, for lack of a better word, shortchanging our employees by 1.2 million. 800,000 of that were the custodians.
Right.
Where's the other 400,000? What categories are covered by that?
And the reason why custodians is so, one reason there's so much of it is there is because there's so many of them. The other will be like 1 and 2 off groups of employees. You know, just, I hate to call out, you know, some of them off the top of my head because there's no money in here for them. So when I say the position, it's saying who it is.
I mean, are they like more clerical?
Mm-hmm. It's office staff. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The other question that I have is, have we built anything? I mean, if the governor decides, and I don't know how he's going to do it, but he did make a campaign promise to raise teacher pay a certain amount.
Right.
And if he decides that come hell or high water, he's going to do that in some capacity. We had talked about making sure that we're able to compensate all our employees percentage-wise that same amount is what we talked about months and months ago.
before the pandemic.
Right. And I'm just saying, is that something that we figured into the budget, or we're just assuming that the governor is just going to have to throw in the towel?
So when he gives teachers that additional money, we get funding for that. So we would only have to pay out of our general fund the people that are not funded by the state. You know, so we do have several teaching positions and all types of positions that the state doesn't fund. So we would have to come up for the difference with them. Now, in the past, when the last time the governor did this, we did add an additional percent for everyone. So everyone got the equivalent to the same raise. It's not included in this budget. We did not feel like we were going to be able to afford it with the potential of austerity cuts coming at us. And we, as a cabinet, believed that these two items would help move us forward the most.
So exception for the custodians and of course the very important pre-K and teachers and parapros. And of course the teachers that are covered by, you know, the certified staff.
Mm-hmm.
The other segments like the clerical, they won't have any pay increase from.
They'll get a
1 year
step
to-
raise. Everybody will get a
step
step
raise.
raise. Mm-hmm. So it's not like they're getting nothing, but and if the governor can figure out how to give that raise to teachers this year, I'm gonna be really impressed. I don't know how he'll be able to do that, but whatever. If he does, I guess we'll cross that bridge and you know, tell you options if you want to extend that to additional staff that are not funded through QBE.
Yeah, Mr. Davis, I think thank you. We based the not putting the teacher increase in there. I think there's been several kinds. The Speaker of the House being the main one who said that there's just no way he sees how that can happen this year. But again, if the governor can pull it off, you know, he also said that, you know, I think he was pushing for a lower state income tax. The Speaker of the House was, and he's basically saying that's off the table. But that's one person. I understand, you know, with all our representatives and senators, that's one person speaking for everyone. But those were the House had actually passed the budget with a few changes and passed it on to the Senate before all this happened. So I think, you know, his comments kind of led me to believe, and I know, you know, he's also been the one that's saying, you know, anticipate up to a 10% cut in spending. So, and I know he's trying to get out there with some figures ahead of the governor a little bit. So I know there's some, you know, the politics being played there, but yeah, that's why we felt like it just wasn't, unless we read something in the next few weeks, and hopefully at some point the governor will start talking about the budget again. I'm sure, trust me, he would be glad to start talking about the budget than having to do a coronavirus update every day. So I'm hoping, you know, he'll start focusing back on the budget here in the next few weeks so we can get a little bit more guidance.
Can I ask a question? I know we're coming up on the hour, so I don't want to delay too much. I participated in the GSBA meeting today. I think a few of the rest of us did as well. Phil Hartley, towards the end, highly recommended creating, most districts doing a spending resolution, because he says the final budget numbers, we will not have the information that we need in time to do the June 30th. So I'm really impressed, first of all, that you've done this already and made some assumptions and that we're in pretty good shape. But do you see any value for this district specifically to do that, to do a spending resolution of any kind? We lose, obviously, the budget considerations you've just talked about if we do a continuing resolution, and I wouldn't advocate for that at all. So I'm glad you've done this alternative. But do you see any reason that any good that would come out of it doing it that way?
You know, I think most districts, when I was on a RISA phone call the other day, are also leaning towards a spending resolution. I think the only thing that scares me, and I think spending resolutions are other than you keep the previous year's budget in place till you approve the current year, which would make it challenging if you change compensation like we're talking about doing. Right. I think the more challenging aspects, Dr. Yeager, would just be, I'm afraid we're going to, and I know we're trying to stay in sync with the county on their tax digest, and they may hit a bump in the road, but they're continuing to move forward with their plan to have a budget by June 30th at the county, okay, or unified government. So I think if we do a spending resolution, we're going to get their timetable off, which is going to mean the tax digest won't be certified. I think if there's any, and I agree with, I respect Mr. Hartley a lot. And I think there is you're running the risk. I think the one advantage we have is we do have the reserve to potentially take that 10% hit right now and try to figure it out without making any other changes that we have to. We also are receiving a large amount of CARES Act money compared to other districts in our area. Yeah. So those things kind of, now we may get to May and we may get, there's no way to have the public meetings and keep in compliance legally, and we may have to put the brakes on a little bit. But I think in talking to Dr. Thomas, our goal is to continue moving forward as best we can right now.
Okay.
If we get to the point we need a spending resolution, we'll definitely walk through that and we'll get with the county and try to figure out how to make that work.
Okay. And you mentioned something about a revised, what did you call it? A budget amendment in July. If we need one, we can still, so if we pass a budget, we can still make a budget amendment later if all hell breaks loose.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. The only risk you run with doing a budget amendment, if you put stuff in there related to salaries, like the compensation study, that stuff's pretty much fixed once you put it in there. So it does limit you on what you can pull out. I mean, what we could do is tell on the operating side. I know last year, I think during the budget process, there was I think it was a 5% reduction for all staffs. We could do that. You know, other, Ms. Duke may throw something at me virtually. If I say it, you can always do a hiring freeze if you have vacancies. We can address stuff. Those are kind of the measures you can go through if you need to. If we see that it's worse than we anticipated, we get to July and we start, there's nowhere else to pull money from. That would be some of the areas we could look at.
Okay. And we could delay raises and these comp increases and then catch them up. Like if we saw, you know, just it completely, as you said, breaks loose, then we could postpone giving the raises and then catch them up if we are able to do it. So, you know, July 1, custodians would be set to get this money and we could make it August or September and then just catch them up for the 2 months they missed.
Great. Thank you very much.
Not ideal. It will be, my staff just virtually threw something at me.
Hopefully we don't have to do that.
Okay.
All right. Are there any additional questions
8:05.
that board members have? You know, we can also, if you have questions that come up, even with this preliminary information, I would encourage you just to reach out to Dr. Thomas or jot those questions down. That way, you know, as the cabinet is putting more meat around things, they can be prepared.
I have one request. It's not so much a question, but I know that the schools had to submit their initial budget request, right? And so could we make sure that the LSGTs are on board with what each school is asking for? Long before we get to the public hearings.
Yeah, is that, Ms. Davis, when you say the LSGTs, is that the charter system money that typically goes to the LSGTs? Is that what you're referencing?
Well, just the whole budget for the school. They seem to sometimes not know what the principal is submitting for the budget and for their particular school. So it would be nice if we could ask the principals to have a readout on their budget requests to the LSGT so that we don't have surprises at the end.
That's a great idea.
Because typically what we do is we allocate, the schools get two sort. I mean, they get, now that we have Fund 150, which I know y'all have heard, we have the QB operating money that we give, that the principals have discretion over that, as well as what money comes from the federal side, which this doesn't, we're not talking about the federal budget at all tonight. So yeah, and then the principal has discretion on how that money gets spent at the school, Ms. Davis. I'm assuming that's what you're mainly talking about,
Right.
that operating.
Because they don't make budget requests to the district, Ms. Davis. They just schools receive allocations from the district. And then they have discretion in how those funds are utilized. So that conversation with LSGT would just be a matter of really not on the front end, but once they have those funds, and then they're usually pretty, not limited because now we have the Fund 150, but we don't, they don't ask for funds up front and then they go back. So they get those funds and then they determine how they want to utilize them.
And
Okay,
Dr.
so-
Thomas, if I may, those funds are determined by the school's FTE count.
Right,
Right.
that's correct.
Yes, sir. That's a good point, Mr. Worley. I was going
That's
to make
correct.
that point. They're based
Yeah.
on their FTEs, and we use the most recent FTE data that we have, which was that October FTE data. That's what we use. And then Mr. Hamill had a dollar figure that it doesn't exactly match QBE because most districts can't. If you ever try to run the numbers on that, it doesn't work out. So, but honestly, we have a higher per dollar FTE for items that I've seen in other districts. So that's good that the schools do get. So, we use those same dollar amounts per FTE. And so really the only difference between the schools is based on that FTE count.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I want us to be. I want the local school governance teams to be in sync with not only how the budget works, but how they get their allocations, and then just to have that conversation about what needs to be different or what's happening at the schools every year as a part of our budget conversation.
And Linda, when we say FTE, you're talking full-time equivalents.
Yes, sir, I understand that language.
Okay, all right.
I'm going to jump in. We're at 8:07, and so we do have an executive session that we need to move into. And so if there are no more burning questions, I don't see any questions listed in our chat or any other comments. I am going to ask that we wrap up the budget conversation, if that's okay with everyone.
So we leave this meeting and go into executive session.
Okay. Yeah. So as soon as we have a pass motion to enter into executive session, you will leave this meeting. Ms. Palmer has sent a separate invite for our executive session meeting, and you will join the executive session meeting through that link. So I'm going to open the floor for a motion. It's at 8:10, a motion to enter into executive session for this, to discuss or deliberate upon the appointment, employment, compensation, hiring, disciplinary action or dismissal, or periodic evaluation or rating of a public officer or employee, or to interview applicants for the position of superintendent.
So moved.
I thought we were
Second.
during this meeting, then we go into the link for executive session.
Okay, so we have a motion to go into executive session and a second. Mr. Worthy, what was that question?
No, I said, I thought we were going to join this call meeting, then we go into an executive session with the executive session link.
That's what we're doing. We typically vote to go into executive session from our regular public meeting.
And then we're just going to walk into the other room to do it.
Right. This was listed on the agenda, right? So,
Yes.
For this meeting. So we have one meeting that has as part of it executive session. So I think we're doing things right.
We're just going to walk into a different Zoom meeting.
That's
Sure.
right. Okay, are there any other questions?
Are we gonna come back here to adjourn the meeting? Okay,
No, we won't.
I think that's where the confusion comes from.
You're gonna go, when you go to your executive session meeting, then Dr. Gant's gonna let us know when you're finished, and we're gonna go back live again.
Okay,
But out
great.
of that meeting.
Thank you.
Yep, so it'll still be, when we adjourn, it'll be a public adjournment of that meeting.
Great.
Okay, all right.
We need a second on this?
We have a second. I
Okay.
think we've addressed questions. Dr. Thomas, if you would do a roll call for us for all in favor of entering into executive session.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis?
I think you said yes, Dr. Thomas.
Sorry.
Thank
Sorry.
you. Mr. Stevens?
Yeah.
Do it right.
Miss Davis?
Yes.
Dr. Yeager?
Yes.
Dr. Dykeman?
Yes.
Mr. Worthy?
Here.
Dr. Gant?
Yes.
Dr. Knox?
Yes.
Dr. Maddox.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. At 8:13, we'll enter into executive session.
Thank y'all.